Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Inside the Vault. I'm your host, Mark Yaxley. Today's guest is Bob Moriarty, a virtual legend both inside the precious metal space and in everyday life. If you're not familiar with Bob, he is the founder of 321 Gold, one of the longest-running websites focused on miners and resource companies. He is also the author of a number of books, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and generally a very interesting person to be around. I first met Bob when I was living in Grand Cayman, and we've remained friends ever since. Bob, welcome to Inside the Vault. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts today.
Good. I'm pleased to be here, Mark.
Well, Bob, long before you got involved in precious metals and mining, you were a pilot in the Marines. And if I'm not mistaken, you were actually the youngest pilot to fly an F-4 fighter jet for the Marines at the time. Is that correct?
Well, it is correct, but it's wrong at the same time. I was actually the youngest naval aviator, and that's only significant because the youngest naval aviator in World War II was, of course, President Bush, and the youngest naval aviator in Korea was F. Lee Bailey, and I was the youngest naval aviator in Vietnam. And that would have actually made me the youngest fighter pilot in the whole world.
So how do you become the youngest fighter pilot in the world? What is it about you that made you, so special and dynamic that they said, well, we're gonna roll the dice on Bob Moriarty and throw him in the cockpit of this expensive airplane?
Well, that's very funny. I was the youngest fighter pilot because I started young.
Okay. I won't ask you for your birthday, but you flew a lot of combat missions in Vietnam. How many times were you in the air during the conflict?
I had 832 missions total. I had about 125 missions in the F-4 and just over 700 in the Cessna Bird Dog.
Wow, very impressive. Is it also true? Well, I know this is true, actually, but maybe you can tell the story briefly for our listeners. You once flew a small aircraft under the Eiffel Tower. Can you tell us how that came to happen?
I don't know anything about that. I'm not admitting anything. I'm in France. There are some things you don't talk about.
Okay. Well, I have a feeling if people Google it, they might find some information on your Wikipedia.
They go to YouTube and look it up. Flight under the Eiffel Tower, I'm told.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Well, let's jump over to the precious metals arena. You've been covering mining and the mining and resource space for a very long time now. You're basically considered a guru in that area. I'm calling you a guru in that area anyway, having known you for a few years now.
Yep.
What's your advice, Bob, for young investors or first-time investors who are just starting to look at mining stocks? How should someone begin that journey?
This is going to sound very self-serving, and it's not really. You wouldn't dream of driving a car without some education. You certainly wouldn't fly an airplane without some education. Mm-hmm. Anybody who just starts throwing money at resources or anything else is a damn fool, and they're going to lose their money. I've written 2 books specifically for investors. The first book was called Nobody Knows Anything, and I make a very strong point. There is no such thing as experts or gurus. There's just people trying to pretend they're experts or gurus. The classic book on investing is Charles Mackay's book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And he wrote that about 1840. And everybody that I know that's a serious investor is familiar with the book. And what I tried to do, and Nobody Knows Anything, was condense it and show the important parts. But I'm absolute about this. There is no such thing as a guru. I am wrong on a regular basis. Everybody I know that's honest is wrong on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. Guys who call themselves experts and gurus pretend they're correct all the time. but they tell people what they want to hear. You can read the book in 2 or 3 hours. It costs $10 on Amazon. If someone that's not willing to invest that kind of money or that kind of time in education, they're never going to succeed in investing. And the second book that I wrote, I released about 18 months ago. It's called Basic Investing in Resource Stocks. And again, what I tried to do with this book was expand on Nobody Knows Anything and cover resources. And the two books together, I think people are going to be reading 50 years from now. They're good books. If you go to Amazon and you look at the reviews, you realize, hey, wait a minute. He may think it's a good book, but everybody who reads it thinks it's a good book too. They are good books, cost you $20, $25 total, and maybe 3 or 4 hours total to read.
Yeah, I remember reading Nobody Knows Anything when you had first published it, and I tore through it in, over the course of a weekend. It's not a very long book, so it's easy to digest, and I know that there's a lot of simple, practical information, and I think it's important that people starting out get that practical information. It's one of the reasons we did our series of videos Inside the Vault as well, for the same reason. Maybe, Bob, you could share one of the key lessons, from either Nobody Knows or Basic Investing in Resource Stocks. What is something practical that people maybe don't know or don't realize as they enter this space that they should think about?
Okay, that's a really good question. And it's so simple that people have a hard time coming to grips with it. If you read Extraordinary Popular Delusions, or if you read Nobody Knows Anything, you start realizing, wait a minute, I don't need to know anything about a specific investment. What I do need to know is human behavior. One of the best examples that I can come up with is Bitcoin. Bitcoin came out of nowhere, and all of a sudden people were pouring literally hundreds of billions of dollars into it. And almost everybody I know was talking about Bitcoin.
Now, are you saying Bitcoin, just to clarify?
No, it's Bitcoin. Everybody's spelling it wrong. They're spelling it Bitcoin, and it's correctly spelled Bitcoin, Bitcon. But there's nothing there. So when everybody wanted it in December of 2017, I looked around and said, I cannot see any practical use for this. I see a lot of people who want to invest because of the fear of missing out. If you understand human behavior, if you understand human psychology, you don't have to know anything about any investment. You need to buy when nobody wants to buy, and you need to sell when everybody wants to buy.
Mm-hmm. So maybe another takeaway here is that studying a little bit of history, doing a little bit of homework would have helped people realize that Bitcoin is just another bubble, perhaps. And I do recall reading that book that you recommended earlier as well. And it basically kind of highlights a series of bubbles throughout history. So if you had read that book previously and done some studying, maybe you would have recognized that this was just the latest fad.
Yeah, and you just raised a good point. Life is a series of bubbles. In 1980, silver and gold were in a bubble. I absolutely believe silver and gold are going to go into another bubble. It's time to buy now because they're cheap, but the time is going to come when they're expensive, and when it's expensive, you should sell. Investing is no more difficult than that. Buy when things are cheap and sell when they're expensive.
So I'm sure there's a little bit of knowledge required to try to determine when something's cheap. For example, I know over the last few years, you and I have done some work together trading precious metals, and you have an uncanny ability. I'm not going to call it picking bottoms, because that's a very challenging thing to do, and nobody can say they can always pick a bottom, but you have a very good ability to buy when something is very close to a short-term bottom or is considered cheap, you must do some homework. You must look at something that tells you, hey, silver's cheap right now. I'm going to come into this with a decent sized position. What are you looking at, Bob, on a regular basis, aside from just having been around a long time and kind of getting a sense of the ebb and flows?
Well, you just raised a good question. There are 5 precious metals that investors can buy or sell at any given time. You've got gold, you've got silver, you've got palladium, you've got platinum, and you've got rhodium. And all of those are available, and all of those can be sold. They're very liquid markets. Mm-hmm. Now, here's what's interesting. If you look at the 5 metals, and if you have any feel for history whatsoever, and I certainly encourage people to do research on their own, you can look at those and say what is expensive and what is cheap. Now, rhodium got as cheap as $600 or $700 an ounce, and it's $5,500 now. Mm. And that certainly would qualify of the 5 metals, rhodium is expensive. And if you look at the price of silver, and if you look at the price of platinum, platinum relative to gold, it's cheaper than it's ever been in history. And silver's about 85 to 1 compared to gold. That's not the cheapest it's been, but it's pretty cheap. So right now, silver and platinum are very cheap. Palladium and gold are relatively expensive, and rhodium is very expensive. It is that simple. You don't have to know anything about demand. You don't have to know anything about gurus. You don't have to know anything about experts. The information is available to everyone, and just look at them and say, historically, is this cheap or is it expensive? If it's cheap, buy it. If it's expensive, sell it. And you know, because literally I sold a rhodium bar to you recently and bought 5 ounces of platinum, and I think I will do very good as a result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just taking that idea one step further of buying cheap and selling when it's high, what I've noticed you do and what some of our other clients do, precious metal investors, especially those who have been around for a while, they'll swap between the different precious metals. So they never exit the precious metals space. Their investment in their precious metals portfolio always remains, but they'll go from what they consider an expensive metal, like you said, right now it could be gold, could be palladium, which has had a great run and might continue. But if you've already made a huge return on palladium and it's starting to look a little bit overvalued, and you can pick up platinum, you know, at literally half the price, you might be doing yourself a favor. And I've seen you do that successfully before. And I know you speak about it in your book as well. And it's a very simple thing to do, to grow your stack without putting more capital into it.
Correct.
Yeah. I wanted to speak to you actually for a minute, Bob, about gold and silver. Obviously, the listeners are always interested to know what people like yourself, I'm not going to call you a guru anymore, a normal guy like yourself, thinks about the price of gold and silver in the near term. I've asked other guests about the mid and long term, and everyone is under the same kind of general conclusion that the uptrend for precious metals in the long term will remain positive. What about the near term, the next 6 to 12 months? What do you see for gold and silver?
Okay. And here's what's interesting, because I would certainly encourage your listeners to broaden their education as much as possible. You have to be aware of what's going on in the world to make any kind of an investment. Since September, the Federal Reserve has literally panicked. They're pumping money into the system. They're expanding their balance sheet tremendously. Something bad is happening. I don't know what it is. The Federal Reserve won't talk about it. I suspect it's Deutsche Bank or something in Europe. But certainly the Federal Reserve pumping up the money supply is going to create inflation. It's already happened in the stock market. So I think that over the intermediate term, the outlook for all of the precious metals is good. In the short term, I would like to see a correction. Gold and silver have been going down lately. I think they could correct into mid-December. Certainly gold shares. Typically at this time of year, everybody sells their losers. So between November 15th and December 15th is a great time to pick up good quality stocks when they're on sale.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned stocks, and actually I wanted to close with this question. I know you're not afraid to put out into the public some of the stocks that you're following or that you like. Are there any you'd like to mention to the listeners that you're following at this time?
I am a very close friend of Quentin Henney. I have met 1,000 geologists. Quentin is one of the top 5 geologists in the world. He happens to be my best friend. He thinks outside the box, and he can do things with projects that nobody else I've ever seen could do. Nova Gold is based in Australia. Well, it's a Canadian company, but it operates in Australia. I think it's going to have one of the biggest gold deposits in history. They've come up with some extraordinary advances in mineral separation. I've been over there 7 times. I just love the company. It's not cheap now, but it's not as expensive as it's going to get. He's also associated with Irving in Japan that has 3 extraordinary projects that I've seen that I think it's going to be one of the highest grade gold projects in the world. And results are starting to come out from Lion 1 that's in Fiji. It's an alkaline system. Some of the biggest gold mines in the Ring of Fire are 5 to 15 or 20 million ounces. And I think Lion 1 will end up being 10 or 15 million ounces.
Wow, that's exciting. Thank you, Bob. Obviously, always a pleasure speaking to you. The insights that you have, and you've just, a lifetime worth of knowledge. I encourage everyone to go on Amazon, look up Bob Moriarty. You're going to find several books that he's published there, all short. So don't feel like you're going to be overwhelmed. They're easy reads and very practical knowledge. Bob, thank you for your time. It was great speaking to you. I look forward to seeing you again personally, hopefully down in Grand Cayman or somewhere else in the world.
Good deal, Mark. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks, Bob. Have a good one.
Okay. Thanks, my friend.
Bye.
Bye.